Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Wall Street's happy, but is the US recovery all down to Trumponomics? What does it mean for the rest of the world? Also this week, official figures show the first acceleration in China's growth since 2010. Plus, how companies hit with huge negative brand publicity can win back consumers' trust. Now, when Donald Trump officially became the US president a year ago, he promised economic protection will lead to great prosperity and strength. He also vowed to change course on a number of international policies and agreements. Now, that prompted warnings he might boost the US economy in the short term, but trigger a global depression. Well, there's been a slew of positive economic data on the domestic front since then. The Dow Jones Industrial Average has raced past the 26,000 mark for the first time in history. Well, joining me now from London is James Knightley. James is the Chief International Economist with ING Bank. Good to have you with us. So, James, how much credit can Donald Trump take for some of the economic gains we've seen on the domestic front, from unemployment to the stock market to growth?
Well, to be honest, I think this year, well, in 2017, he can't really claim all that much. There was a huge amount of domestic momentum that really left, retail sales, industrial production, consumer demand in general, really quite strong. But also another thing that he can't claim is the strength of the global upturn. What has really caught economists and strategists by surprise is the strength in external demand, the strength of Europe, the recovery in Asia. This has come far quicker and far more aggressively than anyone had really been expecting. So that in itself has also boosted the US because, of course, stronger export markets for US products have really boosted overall economic demand. And, of course, also the dollar softness. That, too, has made the US much more competitive.
Well, hang on, let me jump in here. I'm glad you're mentioning that point about the growth in exports. I mean, in his inauguration speech, Donald Trump spoke of protecting US markets. Is he creating greater economic prosperity through protectionism, then?
Well, to be honest, he's not really done all that much on the protectionism front. Yes, OK, he ripped up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was this big trade deal that President Obama had been putting together along with lots of other Pacific nations. But, of course, Hillary Clinton had promised to do the same. So, in actual fact, he didn't really alter the outlook that much. Of course, we are concerned about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico. There's more talks. But to be honest, he seems to be coming around to the idea that actually trade is good. Trade does create US jobs as well. American companies do benefit from trade. So his aggressive stance has perhaps moderated to some extent. He still doesn't think as though America is being treated as fairly as other countries are by trade, and still wants to sort of tweak, to make changes around the edges. But ripping up and completely doing away with free trade agreements, he seems to be pulling back from that assessment.
But as you mentioned, he has done that on the TPP. He's made noises about NAFTA. What has his protectionism stances so far meant for the rest of the world? I
think there is somewhat of nervousness because, of course, the US is the biggest global economy, and having access to that is important for many countries. I mean, for example, Mexico. Trade flows with America equate to nearly 45% of Mexican GDP. So if there's any blockages to that, that's going to be hugely significant for the likes of the Mexican economy. So I think what we're seeing is a greater recognition that perhaps deals that were negotiated 20, 30 years ago perhaps do need to be rewritten to a certain extent, and concessions do have to be made. And that environment makes it more likely that we will get a deal done that won't be too damaging for the global economy.
Let's talk also, if we could, about the global capital flow. He's spoken about bringing money back home to the US. How has the Trump administration's policies so far impacted the global flow of FDI?
So far, there's not that much evidence that it's really been that impactful. I mean, I guess the most direct method he's been using so far has been tweeting, basically threatening or rewarding companies that have or haven't decided to invest in America, particularly American-based companies of course. So those sorts of threats and rewards has influenced policy to some extent. But of course, also we've got tax reform that was agreed on in December. This has meant that US companies, which have perhaps got up to $2.5 trillion of overseas foreign earnings sat there, they didn't want to bring them back because they would have had to pay 35% tax on them. Well, now they're getting special lower tax rates of 8 or 15%, depending on the asset. And that is incentivizing some of the US corporates to bring money home, most notably Apple, which has said that it's going to be investing in a lot more in the US and paying a lot more tax in the US. But also the tax cuts in general have incentivized more and more companies to consider putting money to work in America as well. If you get to keep more of your profits, then that's a good source of, or a good reason to invest. And of course, with the American economy growing so strongly, that was also helping those investment
All right,
flows
so
too.
it's incentivized some to bring the money home. Looking forward, do you expect more companies to follow suit? And how will that tax reform impact the banks, the US economy, and the rest of the world, as I get you to try and look into your crystal ball?
Yeah, I certainly think that more US companies will consider bringing money back. Of course, also, you've got to look at the global story as well. The global growth environment's very, very good as well. So it's getting a balance, isn't it? You still want to have access to those overseas markets and have the ability to invest in those markets too. So it depends very much on the companies and how they see their own individual situations. But in terms of other things, you know, the US economy was already growing very, very strongly. It's grown at 3% annualized in the second quarter. In the third quarter, we're going to have fourth quarter US GDP numbers next Friday, and that's probably going to be another 3% growth rate. We think we're going to get more than 3% growth this year. So having tax cuts in addition to that is just more fuel on the fire. So it's a very positive US growth story, we think, for the next year or two. But also, I'm very encouraged about the global growth prospects. For so long, it's just been a US growth story in the global economy. But now you've got the European story really firing up. You've got Asia firing up. You're starting to get some positive news coming out of Latin America as well. So what was just a global growth, a US growth story, is becoming much more global. And I think that offers some real positive news flow for employment and economic prospects for the next year, year and a half or so.
All right, you mentioned Latin America there, so let's talk, we have to talk about immigration, don't we? How has Donald Trump's stance on immigration thus far impacted countries like El Salvador, Honduras, each of which rely on 8% of its GDP coming in from the remittances of undocumented workers in the US?
That's right. There's obviously Donald Trump has. There's been a lot of concern about some of the comments that has been attributed to Donald Trump in recent weeks about immigration, and of course also you've got these dreamers, this 800,000 people, which are the sons and daughters of immigrants that came to the US illegally. Well, they're still being threatened with deportation. So that factor is adding to concerns for these countries in particular, as you mentioned, that do rely on remittances to such a degree. So, yeah, it does still suggest that there's tough news ahead. But if you can get global growth, if you can get jobs being created, and that spreads more evenly and gets spread around the world, then that can help mitigate those impacts to a certain extent.
And a final one. Have the fears of a currency war with China now dissipated, James?
I think we're starting to see a bit of softening. The Chinese are letting their currency appreciate to a certain extent. We're seeing some really strong growth numbers coming out of China as well. So if you've got growth in the US and jobs in the US and growth in China and jobs in China, then it's less likely that you're going to get the animosity and the risk of a crashing into a confrontation on trade. I think, you know, if people feel confident, people feel relaxed, they're more likely to work together to try and get a good long-term solution that's beneficial for both sides.
Let's leave it on a positive note of working together then. James Knightley there. Thanks so much. China's economy grew by 6.9% in 2017, its fastest pace in 2 years. Economists are surprised policymakers have pulled it off. That's because it's happened while credit growth has been slowed down. Well, joining us via Skype from Shanghai is Ruben Mondejar. Ruben is a professor for Asian initiatives for the IESE Business School. Good to have you with us. So we're talking about the first acceleration in economic growth since 2010. Does this mean the slowdown is over, or is this just a one-off, do you think?
The current picture looks like that the macroeconomic policies are working. The 2017 has been a good year, which I would call a very successful stabilization year. Currency was stabilized and several other things, and that made a very good year for China. Is many things either went up slightly or have been stabilized thanks to the effect of the policies that have been done in the past 2 to 3 years.
But can it continue, Ruben?
If the policies are continuing, I think we will have another good year in 2018.
Another good year, but do you agree with those who say that maybe a slowing down in the property market, controls on infrastructure spending, on local governments, all of that might lead to a good year, but not a continuing acceleration in economic growth? We might go back to the slowdown in economic growth.
But that's being offset by good policies in manufacturing, which is attracting the foreign investments. Foreign direct investments grew in 2017, and I think it's in those same areas that it will give a good year for 2018, especially if the reforms continue. For example, several foreign chambers of commerce have been asking China to open up more sectors of the industries. And if China responds well, that will be good, very good for 2018.
Three regions have admitted to faking their data in 2016, requiring their GDP contributions now to be revised down. Are we getting an accurate picture of GDP growth in 2017?
Well, this has been a big project of President Xi Jinping. I must say, I don't think that only three regions are doing the modeling the accounting figures. It's not just them.
Well, so, if it's not just them, then is growth picking up, or is it picking up even faster? If in previous years other regions were sort of underreporting their economic woes.
No, because this has been discovered precisely. The inflation that's being done after some regions are inflating it. There's also that in the past. As an academic, what we would usually do is then when the national figures are up, we would press them down. And when they are down, we would press them up. We would do additional work. But in this particular year, it seems that despite those regions that have been over-reporting, there has been adjustments being done from the top to put them down precisely to create a better picture.
But how do we know those adjustments are accurate then?
I must say that we have to leave that to the experts, because it's very, very difficult in China, because officials always give figures that, they paint to be the real figures. Now, for us, looking at these figures, we review them. And in 2017, we think that this seemed to be the real picture that we are seeing.
Okay, if it's the real picture, how has China achieved both economic acceleration and at the same time a credit slowdown?
Well, we have to begin with the government efforts to correct the picture. If you will remember, 2015 and 2016, China was sort of, in quotation marks, caught red-handed, manipulating the stock markets and also giving kind of financial information, financial statistics that were very much doubted. So that has been corrected in 2017. Again, the effect of those policies have not only stabilized things, but given rise to also new products, which offsets what was the negative effect. So you may see it as a contradiction in terms, but when you look at the overall effort, so the effects of the economic policies have actually overridden the negative consequences of, bad activities, bad reporting, falsely reporting, and all of those things. In the end, the big picture, I think we are seeing a 2017 which has a more clean figure reporting, and we expect that 2018 will be the same if the watchdog mentality of the government continues to be done in the correct way.
Would you say then that China is now on track to meeting one of its important goals, the reduction of debt?
I think that is too much an assumption to say, because we are looking only 2017. So, and with a big hope for 2018. I think to make a judgment that now they are on a clean bill of health, I think is too much to say. But I would say that the progress is positive.
We'll have to have you come back then perhaps next year and we look at things again. For now, thanks so much, Ruben.
My pleasure.
Still to come on the show, counting the cost of bad publicity. What should businesses do when it all goes wrong? Now, one of the world's largest dairy companies is facing millions of dollars in damages over a baby milk scandal. Police are now investigating after French company Lactalis was accused of trying to cover up the extent of salmonella contamination at one of its plants. Lactalis exports to dozens of countries across Europe, Africa and Asia, and the recall could affect around 12 million tins of the product. Natasha Butler reports from Paris.
After weeks of silence over the contaminated baby milk powder scandal, the boss of French company Lactalis has responded to critics who say the manufacturer covered up the extent of the risk. Emmanuel Beignet has told a French newspaper, "Our priority has always been to handle the crisis and make sure that no more children become sick. We have never minimised the risk of salmonella. We consider that there was no breach of procedures on our side." In December, Lactalis began recalling some of its baby milk products in France. It had discovered the salmonella bacteria in this factory in the northwest. But it's only now that the extent of the contamination has become clear. Lactalis has now withdrawn 12 million tins of baby formula from more than 80 countries. Salmonella can be deadly for young children, and dozens of families in France say that their children became sick after drinking Lactalis baby milk. They have filed lawsuits against the company, saying that it tried to hide the risks and failed to help.
Families were lied to shamelessly, and that the fear was spread by the telephone helpline number, which was provided at the time. How can you believe an operator who tells you that your milk is not affected, but then, 3 weeks later, you learn that it is?
The French President Emmanuel Macron says Lactalis could face penalties. And on Friday, the finance minister said the government would do everything possible to end the crisis.
Lactalis
will take back all baby milk products manufactured at Crown, regardless of their production date, from wherever it is being sold, and in particular from supermarkets and chemists. The aim of this radical step is simple: to avoid delays, problems in sorting batches, and the risk of human error.
Lactalis's boss says his company has launched its own investigation and will pay damages to the salmonella victims. For parents, the focus will be on making sure their children are not exposed to the life-threatening bacteria.
Well, joining us from London is David Hague. David is the founder and chief executive of London-based Brand Finance. David, this story, how does a company bounce back from a story about poisoning babies?
Good question. There's a long history of companies that have actually produce products that have been damaging to babies, and sometimes they handle them very well and they recover fairly fast, and sometimes they don't. So, for example, in 1974, Nestle was producing baby milk that went all over the developing world, and it got involved in a lot of very adverse practices to sell product to mothers, and it denied, and it absolutely damaged their reputation and ruined their business in that market. And here we are 40 years later, they still have not recovered in the baby milk market from that scandal. Whereas Farley's Rusks, which was a product in the UK, had a salmonella scandal. They instantly withdrew the product from the shelves, did a very good information campaign, and they bounced back, and they're back to square one. In China, for example, there's a product called Sanlu, which was implicated in the melamine adulteration scandal for baby milk. And they were damaged very severely because there was quite a gap. And the secret of it is you identify the problem, you get the CEO involved, and you communicate firmly and decisively and take action.
Well, take us through a little more details there about the stages of crisis management, what a company should do first and what it needs to do after that in terms of follow-up to make sure it gets its reputation back in order.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, you have to have a plan. I think one of the problems is that many companies don't have a plan, and they also are not clear who the spokesman's going to be. And there are many chief executives who are extremely reluctant to get involved in these media storms. So the famous example in the last few years where it turned into a disaster was BP, where Tony Hayward, the CEO, was really not prepared for doing media interviews and kept putting his foot in his mouth, getting everything wrong, and it just made the scandal worse. So good companies have a well-briefed CEO who knows exactly what's going to happen, and they do role-playing and what-if situations in advance. They have a playbook. They know exactly how to bring everything into sharp focus and make sure everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet right from day one.
Even however good your plan is, though, is damage control getting a lot difficult now in the era of social media?
Well, you could argue that, in that things reverberate around the world and go around consumers very fast using social media. But I think you could take it the other way around. You know, if you actually manage social media well, it allows you to get your message across much more quickly and much more forcefully. So it isn't necessarily the case that wider, faster and deeper coverage is going to damage you. It really depends on the way you deal with it.
All right, so managing a crisis, that you could argue both ways. What about stopping a crisis from breaking out in the first place? Is that part getting a lot more difficult now, again, in the era of social media where you don't have an editor sitting there to check facts and information before he puts it on his front pages? Everyone can just go tweet happy on anything they think right now.
Well, I think one of the issues is what Donald Trump goes on about, which is fake news. You know, I mean, it isn't necessarily fake news. It might just be wrong information, and wrong information goes round and round. So yes, it's true that there's more chance that it can go wrong. But I think what it comes back to is the level of preparation and the way in which companies deal with it. You know, companies have got to be open, and to begin with, they've got to be doing things which are acceptable. In the UK at the moment, there's a case going on about Royal Bank of Scotland that had a unit which allegedly intentionally sent its customers bankrupt in order to sell their assets. And that's going round and round because apparently they behaved in a very bad way. Companies that behave in a bad way will get found out in the current era.
Now, when you add celebrity power into the mix of changing dynamics as well as social media, that makes quite a powerful combination there. Is that impacting the job of PR practitioners too?
Well, certainly. I mean, celebrity power has always been extremely strong. Brands try and get celebrities to endorse their products, and the reverse of that is if, you know, someone like Angelina Jolie stands up and says she doesn't approve of a product because it's behaving the wrong way, or any other film star or celebrity, it's going to have a lot of power.
But they can do it now in a tweet, as we saw over the controversy over H&M's ads. You can have a famous person come out and say, I'm not going to buy your clothes anymore, and he's got a lot of followers. Then what do you do?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Well, I think H&M have responded very fast. They apologised almost immediately. They said they got it wrong, and they're now taking corrective action on that particular issue.
All right. Thanks so much for your thoughts on that. Apple says it's going to create 20,000 jobs for American workers. The iPhone maker says the investment will contribute $350 billion to the US economy over the next 5 years. The US tech giant has faced criticism in the past for employing huge numbers of workers in Asia. It's also taken flack for avoiding US taxes by keeping cash reserves in foreign bank accounts. BP has revealed it'll pay an additional $1.7 billion this year towards the Deepwater Horizon accident. The 2010 environmental disaster continues to weigh on the company's finances. Now, the total cost, including lawsuits, has come in above $65 billion. The explosion at a well in the Gulf of Mexico killed 11 people and dumped around 500 million barrels of oil into the sea. Emirates Airlines says it struck a $16 billion deal with Airbus to buy 36 Super Jumbos. Airbus had recently warned it may be forced to abandon production of the 380 planes unless it received more orders. Deliveries are scheduled to start in 2020. And finally, My number of the week is 1.1 degrees Celsius. Scientists at the UN say 2017 was one of the warmest years to be recorded since the 19th century. Environmental researchers fear it's part of a worrying trend, greenhouse gases driving up global temperatures and changing our environment. Well, we are now edging towards the 1.5 degrees Celsius ceiling that was set as the top limit for global warming under that 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. And that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.